Okay, just so that we have plenty of time to be able to do this, I'm sure people will filter in. I think there's a little bit of confusion in terms of which floor it's on. But we'll get started. So thanks to everybody who's here. Thank you for coming. I'm very excited to have a conversation with Miranda today. Before we get going, there's a QR code there. That's for the newsletter and events for the CJMD. We've always got stuff coming up. I think something that we've got in the spring is the city of Seattle has a new mayor, and the new mayor has, Adrian, correct me if anything I'm saying is incorrect, has a new AI initiative, and the...
Yeah, an AI officer.
An AI officer. I heard someone say czar.
That's the Turk.
That's the Turk.
I think that's what she's called. No, maybe not. Anyway.
The AI sultan, maybe. But at any rate, we're going to have a conversation between Austin Jenkins, Adrian, and the AI person from the city of Seattle. So it should be an interesting conversation, obviously topical and timely. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff and more, just go there. So today we have Miranda Spivack, who is a veteran reporter and editor who works on issues of government secrecy and accountability, often looking at issues of development, urban development. She worked for the Washington Post.
In the good old days.
In the good old days. Maybe she can talk about that at some point. She's written for the New York Times, for McClatchy, other places. And she's here today to talk about her book, Backroom Deals in Our Backyard. She does have some copies of the book, so if anybody's interested in purchasing them, just come up to me or come up to Miranda after the talk. The way we're going to structure it is we'll do about half an hour of just sort of back and forth conversation between Miranda and myself, and then we'll open it up for questions. We've got an hour, so anything that you're interested in asking, just sort of jot down notes, and we'll have plenty of time to be able to talk collectively.
That's good.
So, Miranda, I wonder if you could just talk about this, how you got the idea for the book. And as a preface to that, I'll say that I read a fair amount of these things, and there's a lot about secrecy at the national level, the federal level, and a lot of stuff about the problem. And you've written about secrecy at the local level and possible solutions. So I'm kind of curious just how it is that you got into this topic and this angle on it.
Yeah, good question. Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm really happy to be here, even if it does rain a lot. I know, I was prepared. So the genesis for this kind of coverage really started when I was at the Washington Post. And I left the Post almost 13 years ago, just to give you a little context. And it happened to be right at the time when a guy named Jeff Bezos bought it. I'm sure you've never heard of him, but and we can talk about that later. But anyway, I had been an editor at the Post, always on the local staff, which at the Post people were like, why don't you want to cover Congress? Why don't you want to, and I actually had done a lot of that already, working for what was then a good regional paper, the Hartford Courant, in their Washington bureau. And I really always felt that local news was really way more important to our readers, way more important to how people live their lives, even though I was in the Washington area, and obviously it's a federal world there, but I just felt like, this is a region of 6 million people, bigger than many states. Maine has under 1 million people, Wyoming, they're way smaller than the Washington region if you looked at it as a state. Billions of dollars in public money are being spent by local governments, and we don't know what's going on. So I was at the time, in Prince George's County, Maryland, where, you can Google this, the county executive and his wife were both busted for corruption. They were caught on an FBI wiretap where he gets busted but not arrested, and because they know what's going to happen next, he's going to call his wife and say, get rid of the money, and she says, what should I do? And he says, flush it down the toilet. This is true. This is true. And meanwhile, there are FBI agents knocking on their door. He's driving, and she stuffs something like $75,000 in cash in her bra. I kid you not. So that was sort of what I was up against. And this was it was county government there, and that's sort of the Washington region, and that's actually the South versus New England or other parts of the country. county government is really how it's run. And I was having a terrible time getting basic information from this county government, which was headed by this corrupt leader. And I wanted stuff like, what kind of outside contracts do you have? You know, is the county executive's brother-in-law getting an outside? I mean, you're sort of thinking like, who's making money off of this government? And why, you know, why isn't it posted online, one might ask, but it wasn't. So I was doing Maryland Public Information Act requests and getting nowhere. And, you know, I was lucky. At the time I was at the Washington Post. They were the big dog. We had great in-house counsel. I mean, we did a lot to, you know, try to get this information. But what it really made me think about was, okay, I'm a journalist. I know how to do this. What if you are so-and-so down the street who is upset about a pothole on your street, and you want to find out who's getting their potholes repaired in your community and why isn't mine being repaired? Or you have a kid in the public schools and you want to find out how much money is being spent school by school, and is my kid's school getting the right amount of money for the kinds of, you know, needs that they have? So what's it like if you're that person? And that's really what ultimately led me to do a story for Reveal, which is called State Secrets. It's still online. If you're up at 2 in the morning and have nothing better to do, you can read that. That was sort of the impetus ultimately for writing the book. But I really wanted to tell this through the eyes, not of journalists, not of lawyers, but civilians, as we call them in the news biz, right? And then, you know, you come to discover how opaque, how non-transparent state and local governments are. And I sort of knew it instinctively just from my own experience, but man, it is bad everywhere. So that's the inspiration for the book.
So I wonder, given your interest in local news, so there's a very, very local dimension in one of the chapters of the book where you write about someone who actually got in a cycling accident on the Montlake Bridge.
Right here.
And then spent a long time trying to actually get the Washington State Police to release the accident log.
Right.
I wonder if you can, just as a sort of way into it, if you can tell us a little bit about the case. Who was the person? What did he want? And what were the issues that he encountered?
So the lawyer is a guy named Kessler, and now you're killing me. I can't remember the name of that.
The guy is Gendler, Michael Gendler.
Michael Gendler, who is actually quadriplegic, because he had a terrible accident on the Montvale Bridge, which I crossed over today finally, having seen photos of it. And his lawyer, I think it was Kevin Kessler, wanted to get accident data because he thought maybe the government was negligent in not fixing this bridge. And Gendler, who was a cyclist, had gone over the bridge many times and had thought it was not in a good condition. So there's another case that came out of Washington State called Pierce County versus Guillen, Guillen, I think. And that was decided by the US Supreme Court by none other than Clarence Thomas, who wrote the opinion. And that ruling said that a federal law that Congress had passed, mostly at the behest of states, allowed states to keep this kind of data secret, and also to refuse to give out if they had done engineering studies or any kind of report. And that was the kind of stuff that Kessler wanted, because he wanted to make a case against the city, probably, or whoever controls that bridge, that they had been negligent and that his client was entitled to compensation. So they had a couple strikes against them. One was already the Supreme Court ruling had basically said all this stuff is exempt, and that had been a reversal of the Washington State Supreme Court, which had said, give it out. So what they did was they were actually asking for the State Department of Transportation for a lot of this data, and they also were asking for, I guess, the state police. And what they finally did was they got individual accident data from the police and were able to crunch it themselves and discover what the accident rate was. And yes, guess what? You know, they should have fixed the bridge. This guy, I haven't been in touch with him for a long time, but that, his life was wrecked. And that, they did a workaround, because the problem is that except in Kansas and New York State, where there have been state court rulings that went the other way, basically any state Department of Transportation can keep this information secret. And the reason the Congress had said they could, and then supported by the Supreme Court ruling, was because state and local governments will apply for federal funds to fix stuff. And in order to do that, they are asked, of course, all this may change now given who's in office in Washington, but up until now, they had to rank their sites. So, this is the worst one. This is the one that needs the most most money. This is the one that 1 through 10. And so that's what the U.S. Supreme Court said could be kept secret, because it would show, of course, that they knew they had a problem, but they were trying to fix it. So anyway, what these guys did, Kessler, both lawyers and his client, they were able to get the data piecemeal from the police, and then they crunched it themselves. The problem is that if you are a community person, who just wants a little bit of data, you don't have the wherewithal or the resources to do that. And it's ridiculous that this kind of secrecy can go on. I mean, these are tax-funded studies, right? Your tax dollars have already paid for them. Why can't we have them? And it also gives you insight into the decision-making, some of which may be poor by the government. Maybe they're not doing all the right things to figure out which are the worst intersections. In fact, that was sort of a subtext of a bigger story that I wrote in the book about Bethesda, Maryland, which happens to be where I live. And there was a horrible, horrible intersection where teenagers at 7 in the morning, who had been on 3 hours of sleep and up all night, and then they're going to high school, they were driving and making this very dangerous left turn. And so somebody wanted to get the engineering studies from the state of Maryland, could not get them for the same reason. And, they couldn't really do the workaround that the lawyers did here. And so, it's sort of, that story shocks people. Every time I tell people, guess what? The Department of Transportation, they know what they're doing, and they're not going to let you look over their shoulder. And in fact, in Maryland, when they were finally able to, the community people were able to get some of the data themselves from the local police, they ultimately discovered that the state had failed to calculate it, the accident rate, correctly. Surprise! So.
One of the rationales that, and this is somewhat connected, that I think people would find surprising is trade secrets.
Yeah.
That governments will say, we can't share this information with you because of trade secrets.
Right.
And so there is this case in the book involving a guy by the name of Richard Boltic, who wanted to read a study about a traffic light on a busy road.
Right.
And I wonder if you can just talk about that case, and then also why is a trade secret permitted as a
this
rationale?
is actually something I'm going to talk a lot about tomorrow, because the trade secret exemption to public disclosure, every state has it, the federal government has it, and it is being widely used and abused by companies that are doing work for the government, so they're being paid with your tax money again. But when somebody, and Amazon has done this and others, somebody wants information, a member of the public wants information, what happens is that the governments will go to the contractor and say, okay, so-and-so's asked for this, or in the case of Richard Boltic, he was asking for engineering studies. And the contractor will say, oh, well, you can't give that out because it's a trade secret, and if you do give it out, it hurts my competitive position in the marketplace. And that's what trade secrets are all about. The problem is governments are ill-equipped. Now, I couldn't tell you what a trade secret is, right? So certainly some poor person who's processing, 50 FOIA requests, they don't know what a trade secret is. And so the companies are really running the show on that. And what they do is they hold back information that they should not hold back. there's a case in the book out of Los Angeles where a bus company called New Flyer got a contract to make buses for the Los Angeles metro system. And one of the ways they got the contract was they got extra points because, they said they're going to pay local wages, they're going to hire locally, they're going to give good benefits, blah, 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 blah. So that brought them to the top of the heap. They get the contract. And then an outside group called Jobs to Move America, a few years later, they wanted to know, did the company uphold the terms of the contract? And the Los Angeles metro system, which is, the transit authority in Los Angeles, was ready to give out the information. And the company, New Flyer, intervened in the case and said, no, you can't give out that information, even though we used it to get the contract that you're paying for. We can't give out that information because it's a trade secret. So that was litigated in California, and actually a state court ruled they had to give it out, that the public interest trumped the trade secret argument, and they gave out so they finally, this took several years, they finally gave out the data, and guess what? New Flyer was not upholding the terms of the contract. They weren't paying a livable wage, they weren't paying the benefits, they weren't hiring local, all this stuff. And of course, one wonders, why isn't the government monitoring the contract? But, they have hundreds of contracts. I mean, I cannot, and as we all know, and I think to be fair, you have to recognize that state and local governments are underfunded, right? So you're going to pay for the FOIA person, or are you going to pay for fixing that bridge?
Yeah.
It's tough. So yeah, the trade secrets thing, and then there was in another case that I mentioned, there's a judge, William Alsop, who's in Northern California, a federal judge, and there was an argument about trade secrets in a defense contract, and he said, listen, trade secrets, basically this is bullshit, and except he was more judicious than I am. And he said, I have seen all kinds of things in the public domain that you guys are now claiming to be trade secrets. It's really, he was overturned, by the way, by the Ninth Circuit, unfortunately. But, it's a big, big problem. And I think what you're having more and more is what I would call corporate capture of state and local governments. I mean, they're in the driver's seat way more than they used to be.
So that sort of brings me to something that I was going to ask about later, but maybe I'm curious to hear your thoughts about now. And that has to do with who uses the open record system. And so I think oftentimes when people read something like this, they say there needs to be more, openness in the open record systems. But one of the things that I think your book brings up is that for the most part, it seems to be used oftentimes by private interests to basically offload the cost of doing business onto government. And so it's used to get news about regulation or information about rivals and stuff like that.
Right.
And so I guess the criticism would be that government is actually taking on the cost of responding to records in ways that benefit business. And so I'm just curious, you've spent so much time on this, your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is controversial among open government advocates. I recognize that, because the idea is open records should be equally available to everybody. That's the underlying principle of the Washington Coalition for Open Government and others, and I get that. The problem is that data, both federally and state and locally, show that the vast users of public records requests are corporations. And they are flooding the zone, as we say, and often it is, find out about who got the contract, what my rival is getting paid. And the taxpayers, you say the government is underwriting it, we're underwriting it.
Yeah.
That's us,
yeah.
Right? And I think, and this is, Jim's gonna find this controversial, I think, or his board is, but I think that open government advocates need to recognize the cost to taxpayers who are bearing the cost of open records. And I would say, and there may be an equal protection problem with this, but I would say There needs to be a tiered system, each according to his ability to pay. How about that? Community groups, you can have it for free, right? But, Amazon, come on, they can pay. And this is very controversial, I know that, but I think we're in an era where, when you see the percentages, and this is true in the federal data that the Justice Department collects and others, it's like 80% is businesses using this system, and they're clogging it. And so you're over here because you want your pothole fixed, get in line. Yeah. Or in my book, this guy in Alabama it's really a horrible story of sewer overflows in a poor community that's gone on for 40 years, right? And he tries to, the former high school shop teacher, he's the hero of this story, he tries to get data from the state, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is underwriting a lot of this, and they stonewall him for 2 years. And he finally gets some legal help from Yale Law School's, had an environmental clinic, and then that professor moved to Vermont, and they represented him, and a federal judge in D.C. told the U.S. Department of Agriculture, quit stonewalling, cough up this stuff. But, come on, that is an urgent need. Amazon's, concern about a data center, and that's a whole nother topic we can get into. Not so urgent, plus they can pay.
Yeah. So one of the other criticisms, of course, I'm just trying to set up a lively discussion for afterwards and asking these questions. But one of the other criticisms sometimes is like the so-called vexatious requesters.
Yes.
That there are political, groups that will basically just seek to like gum up the works of like environmental regulatory agencies. Yeah. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I think again, the data will show that vexatious requests are not that often. They're annoying as hell. And you know why people are vexatious requesters? Because they've been stonewalled, right? Yeah. So how about government putting those contracts online? Start with that. How about trying to be more helpful to a civilian? And I'm sorry to keep using that term, but I'm talking about non-lawyers, non-journalists. Yeah. Why not try to be more helpful to them? Why not? I was looking at the Attorney General's website here in Washington State. They claim they do all this training for the government. How about doing it for the people? Why, you're looking like, is there somebody from the AG's office in here? Anyway, yes. Also, there are public universities, and there is a movement, and it's largely on the right, but not exclusively on the right, to really harass professors, and they're getting a lot of, requests. So maybe the university needs to think about how to deal with that and help the professors who are being, hounded by some of this stuff. It's true there are vexatious requesters, but I'm less inclined to try to regulate that. And of course, I think Washington State is trying to regulate that, right? They're trying to limit that. Who's going to decide?
Yeah.
Got it.
So a question about the role of journalists. One of the things that's interesting in the stories is like the people who are doing the research are civilians, as you're calling them. And then the way in which they're publicizing it is they're just going on Facebook, social media. Local journalists are not entirely absent. Like I tried to count at one point, like the Albany newspaper shows up in one of the cases, But like for the most part, local news media are pretty absent. And so the question I had was like, is this partly a function of your choice to focus on civilians, as it were, or is this also a reflection of like who's actually doing the work?
I think it's a reflection of the vast news deserts around the country. You guys, okay, you're in a big city, you've got some reasonably robust media here, but come to Alabama, come to Mississippi, come to parts of Utah. Rural parts of the country are way underserved by the media. And in fact, I was telling Matt that I wrote this whole chapter about Alabama, and it is still an ongoing fight in that community. And I have tried over and over to get reporters in Alabama. Here it is. I wrote 95% of it. You can update it. I'll just give it to you. Get these people some help. And I can't. Part of this is probably okay. Northern out-of-stater coming in and telling you guys something. I think that's part of it. But part of it is that they're either too busy. They don't see the significance of it. But I think the local media ecosystem is suffering a lot in this country. And then, you want to talk about the threat to democracy. That's a whole another theme, but that's a big part of it. So I think we have a big problem, and we need to really think about it. Some states, and I have mixed feelings about this, some states are viewing local journalism as sort of a public utility, and they're actually subsidizing it. Of course, the risk there is that, you have some legislature that doesn't like what you're reporting on, and then they'll pull the plug. So I don't think it's a good long-term thing, but it's an interesting concept. It is a local utility in many ways.
How about, I know we have a bunch of students here, tips for student journalists, and I know that you have a whole chapter at the end that's kind of like a how-to, but if you were to, give a couple-minute lesson where it's like, here are 3 things that student journalists should know about open records, or, what would that be?
Well, I think the first thing that I always tell everybody, student journalists, community members, whatever, is get to know the people who actually possess the records and do it in person. I know this is like, what? Students are like, what do you mean I can't text them? No. No. Go in person. I taught for a couple of years at DePauw University in Indiana, and some student came to me and said, I emailed that professor 3 times and they never responded to me. And I said, this guy's office is like 2 blocks from here. Would you please go knock on that person's door? But if you can figure out what your issues are or think ahead, try to get to know the people who control the records. Ask them how they keep the records, what format. What kind of stuff do they keep? Do they keep contracts? Do they have receipts? Do they, just go make a friendly visit. Start with that. And, and for young journalists, I think, you're looking for story ideas. Go talk to these people. When they want to be helpful, they know a lot of stuff and can help you. And same with court clerks and others. They know. Courts are really fascinating. They know everything. Court clerks know everything. They know which judges are nuts. They know what the prosecutors are working on. They got the whole thing. And so you got to cultivate these people, and you got to do it in person. That is probably my overarching advice.
I'll ask one more question, then I'll open it up just so that we can turn it into a conversation. What person besides yourself is someone that you would point to and be like, this is a journalist or an organization that does great work with open records?
Are you guys familiar with Muck Rock? I think they're pretty amazing. Michael Morrissey he was a Boston Globe reporter. He's like 42 now. I think he started this when he was 25. I'm not quite sure why he figured out, but so they help people sometimes for a fee to file open records requests all around the country. So actually, when I was having trouble in Alabama, because it's one of the states that insists that not only do you have to be a resident of the state, you have to be a citizen of the state, another bad U.S. Supreme Court decision that allows that. There are 15 states that require that. So you got to find a proxy to go who's in the state, who's a citizen, could show their passport or whatever, to go file for you. But Muck Rock has people all over the country who will help you, which is huge. So I would definitely look at them. They've really expanded and grown. And just in the interest of full disclosure, Michael and I have applied for a grant together from the University of Missouri. So I don't know if we're going to get it.
Okay.
Cool. But they're great.
I feel like I could ask a bunch more questions, but we're right at 5:30, so just so that we have a conversation, why don't we open it up and see what questions people have. Questions, one thing I learned in filing open records requests this year is that you get better responses if your questions are more specific. So maybe we could use, in the spirit of open records requests, specific questions rather than general comments. So yeah, let's open it up. Who has a question?
Come on, you guys. Don't be shy.
So, writing a book, pretty heavy endeavor. Can't always put everything in there that you want to put in there. Was there something just really juicy that you wish you could have put in there and just like maybe your editor would have let you or you didn't
This is a great question. Yes, in fact, I have an example. And actually, I salvaged this. It's in the conclusion. But there was a community in Northern Virginia called Gum Springs where people who live there, it's very small and it's getting smaller because it's getting surrounded by fancy development. But people who live there are the descendants of people who were enslaved at Mount Vernon. And Fairfax County, Virginia is like messing with them. You know, they're letting developers do all kinds of things that the community doesn't want. They're not really informing the community. They've tried to dump a lot of low-income housing there, and you know, Gum Springs has already got low-income housing, and they're saying, how about Bellhaven up the street, you know, where all the rich white people live? How come they can't have this housing? You know, it's a really, to me, a very interesting story. I actually went to high school with some people from Gum Springs, which is sort of how I knew about it. And this was right at the time, this will tell you how old I am, that Virginia integrated their schools. I mean, Virginia, you know, Brown versus Board of Education, 1956, I think. Forget it. Virginia was like 10 years it took them to integrate schools. So I'm really fascinated by that story, and I was fascinated, you know, just sort of the historic significance of the community. There was a protagonist who was very, you know, that's part of it, is people have to talk to you or you can't really write it. And my editor just did not like that story. I don't know why. And, you know, I mean, there was all kinds of secrecy. I thought it was a great story. So finally, we went back and forth, and she said, put it in the conclusion. So I took, you know, 20 pages and compressed it to 1.5. And interestingly enough, C-SPAN invited me on Book Talk, and what was the story they wanted? Gum Springs. So that woman and I, Queenie Cox and I, were on C-SPAN together for an hour. I was like, okay, I was right.
I hope you emailed the clip to your editor.
You know, I didn't.
In all of your work in these small towns or these small communities, these county governments, you come across, did you do any public records requests where you found out people were talking about how to avoid public records requests? Or even better, mentioning you, like avoid doing that? I've had that experience.
You know, yeah, I'm not in the context of the book. I have had that experience. And occasionally avoided myself, which is a little disturbing. But yeah, actually, no. This lawyer for this water board in Alabama, they're the ones for whom millions of dollars are being passed through with no accountability, and they still haven't fixed the sewers. No, that guy was very open. He told his board not to talk to me, and you know, one of them was about to talk to me, and then she said, "Ooh, I got a message from Prince Chestnut," is this guy's name, and he said, "Don't talk to her." I was like, okay, I didn't even have to FOIA that one. So, yeah, I mean, you can sort of tell, you know, when people got the word. Right. Yeah.
You alluded to kind of majority of the requests being from large companies, and a lot of smaller local communities are, as you also alluded in the conversation, are impacted by conversations around data centers coming into town, which there's a local level of decision making that impacts actually that process. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that type of requests and what they're asked for and who's asking for them?
Yeah, well, you know, the whole data center thing has really exploded around the country, and I know you've got it going here too. So I think that one of the things to really be on the lookout for about data centers is that local governments are signing non-disclosure agreements with data centers. And this is happening in a lot of places. Virginia is what they call data center alley. There's like gazillions of them, and communities are fighting it. You know, they're noisy, they pollute, all the things you already probably know. But so somebody there tried to file a public records request to get they had heard there was an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, between this town and the data center, which I think was Microsoft was, but it was an LLC hiding who the company was too. And the town did what in the federal world they called the GLOMAR response. They wouldn't confirm or deny that there was an NDA. Yeah, I mean, they couldn't even get acknowledgement that there was an NDA. And so a lot of the requests about data centers are actually from what I have not calculated it, so I hesitate to say, but anecdotally, it's coming from communities and local businesses, and utilities are also trying to find out, how much are they going to use, how much water are they going to use, and there's not a lot of candor, as you may know. And half the time we don't even know whose data center it's going to be. It's a big problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. I'm not a journalist, so this might seem like a little bit of a basic question, but I'm curious, like, what is the hardest part about finding all of these stories, and do you have tips for kind of overcoming those obstacles?
Yeah. Well, you got to be willing to sort of blunder into all kinds of places. And I think that's hard. I think being a journalist, you sort of learn people are going to hang up on you. They're going to blow you off. They don't like you. I mean, you can't go into this business and think you're going to be liked, except by your colleagues in the newsroom, hopefully.
Not always then.
Yeah, not right. You just have to keep pushing until, I probably talked to 20 different people before I settled on 5. And as I said earlier, you're only, as a journalist, everybody talks about investigative reporting and whatever, you're only as good as the people who will talk to you and the documents you can get. There's no big mystery to this. And one of the fears I always have when I'm trying to tell a story, whether it was in the daily paper or writing a book, is that what am I missing by these people who won't talk to me, and am I being fair about what I'm seeing? And so you constantly have to be sort of checking yourself, but you really just have to keep pushing and have a thick skin. Right.
So I feel like we're kind of in a Wild West era of innovation with AI specifically. And historically, in these kind of Wild West eras of innovation, like with oil and the teapot dome scandal, we see that innovation kind of outpaces democratic oversight.
Uh-huh.
So what do you think the implications are for local, state, and federal government with AI specifically?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you got to look at all the lobbying money that the AI companies are spending. It's enormous. And basically, they don't want any regulation. I think you can start with that premise. So what's the public interest in regulating AI? How do we define that? How do we get the legislatures not to be bought off quickly, but to ask probing questions? Just news organizations have been suing like crazy because all their work is being stolen, basically. And, copyright be damned, so I don't know. I think one of the problems is, and this is a problem with open records laws in general, is that technology is constantly outpacing the law. And we've got to really think, we have to recognize that, we have to understand what the risks are, and then we have to sort of be able to find a way to coalesce. I don't have any good answers in a way, but I think we have to at least acknowledge the problem for starters before we can even talk about solutions. But, I would look at campaign finance and lobbying disclosure, and if you're writing about this, who's spending the money and who's making money? What law firms are making big money out of this? And what's their sort of record? But it's a tough one. But, you know, I think we've seen this over and over, is that technology is way ahead of the law. So it's risky.
Do you think, though, that technology and AI could actually turn out to be a solid tool for improving public record systems and improving access? I think in many cases, local governments resist that in part because they don't want to make it too easy.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I don't know. I haven't done a lot of work with AI, but when I have, it's like half of what you get back is inaccurate. So you could use it as a search tool for open records, but then you're still going to have a human being sort of double check it. So, you know, it may be worthwhile. I know there are companies out there that are pitching this as, you know, we can short circuit your public records request. I just think it's flawed, and so we have to be cautious about it. But yeah, I mean, why not give it a try? You know, the big complaint from governments, and I am somewhat sympathetic to them, it's, you know, they don't have the staff to do this stuff, and so the public has to say, look, this is a priority. This is our money being spent. So do what they call proactive posting. You know, why aren't the contracts online? Why, you know, and the details. I mean, that's pretty easy. Everything's digitized. Those contracts are not coming in paper anymore. So, you know, but there's a real reluctance on governments, and, you know, some of it, I mean, you can never underestimate incompetence, but some of it is deliberate obfuscation. So, yeah.
Yeah, out here in Washington State, we're pretty preoccupied with just what's happening in our state. And it feels like public records laws are under assault.
Yeah.
I mean, the state legislature every year passes more exemptions to the act.
Right.
You know, advocates have to fight back legislation every year that would basically poke more holes into it. But you're operating on a wider landscape, and so I'm curious, like, what you're seeing across the states and the nation.
Very similar. I mean, if you were to try in Maryland, where I live most of the time, to figure out what are the exemptions to public records requests, they're sprinkled into all kinds of other legislation. You know, that's not all in the public records law. And I think that's sloppy, maybe purposeful, but, you know, Dave Coulier, you're probably familiar with him at the University of Florida. They've done a study recently that just showed that the response time across the states is way lower. It's like things are much slower. The actual responses are down from about 50% 10 years ago to about 30% now. You know, the people just don't even get the records. The federal government, of course, is a complete disaster now as far as open records go, and part of that is because, you know, the Trump administration's taken down all this data. I mean, health data, HIV data, maternal and child mortality data. You know, we have a measles outbreak. Good luck trying to figure out where that is. It's really terrible. And so, yeah, so you want me to be optimistic? It's really bad. And, you know, what's happening in Washington State is generally happening. I looked, in fact, Jim and I talked earlier about it. He was saying, you know, who's doing it well? And I'm like, scratching around to find a state that's doing well. Some cities are doing some stuff, you know, with economic development. Some of them are being a little bit more transparent than they used to be, but there's not a lot of good news on that front. So you guys are not alone, I will tell you that. Anybody else? Yeah.
Across the accidental activists that you talk about, what did you see was similar about them? What made them successful?
Yeah. Well, they're very, you know what happens is these are issues that come into their backyard, right? Or their front yard, or their kitchen table. And first of all, they think, okay, I'm going to go to my local government, I'm going to get help. And that is not happening in these cases. Guy in Hoosick Falls, New York, Michael Hickey, suspects there are drinking water is poisoned. He goes to the mayor, and the mayor has this big, it's a small town, he has this big program called Hoosick Rising, and they're gonna put Hoosick Falls on the map, and it's gonna be a cool place to live. And the mayor says, you think the water's polluted here? Don't tell anybody. It's like, what? So, what happens is they get rebuffed, they get really mad, they get really angry. I mean, the firefighter wife whose husband got cancer, she's like, I am not giving up on this. So first they get, they try and they are innocent and they think, oh yeah, I'm from the government, they're gonna help me, right? No. And then they really get mad and then they become expert internet sleuths. I mean, the amount of research these folks have done is really remarkable. And, they were reading scientific documents, whatever. I mean, they're very much self-taught, but they are also very, very tenacious. There's sort of this disbelief that, why can't we fix this problem in our community? This is not a unique problem. Poisoned drinking water, not a unique problem. And some of these situations have gone on for a decade. Hoosick Falls, New York is finally maybe getting clean water, although people are skeptical that it's actually going to be clean. The sewers in Alabama are still not fixed. I mean, that one is just outrageous. They're all outrageous, but I think some of this, they evolve, I don't think they set out to do this, and they think it's going to be a lot easier, and then they find it's not so easy. But they stick with it. And they build networks. That was the other thing, is they really get their community involved. And that's crucial. You cannot do this stuff alone. It's absolutely exhausting. So. Yeah?
So I have not yet read the book, but I know that...
That's okay, there's no quiz.
But I know that one of the exemptions for FOIA requests is Homeland Security.
Yep.
So did you come across much of that when it came to your research?
Yeah, the book, I wrote the book I started researching the book around 2020, right at the beginning of COVID, actually, so that was challenging. So a lot of what has happened in the last year or so is, not in the book. National security is definitely an exemption to public disclosure at state level as well as federally. So, you want information on the nuclear power plant, that's going to be very hard to get. The electrical grid, you're going to bump into that kind of a problem. Homeland security, I did not run into, but I know that people are running into huge blockades, and also the relationship between police departments or the use of the flock license plate reader, is that being shared with ICE? Yes, some cities are. Do we know about that? There's a lot of stuff to look at now, but I haven't really done that. But I would encourage you guys to look at the flock thing is really a problem, because there's a default apparently in the contract so that police departments have to opt out of sharing the data. Right. Otherwise, other agencies can come in and demand it. So
at least a few police departments in this state have withdrawn from flock.
I saw that.
And maybe just so for people who don't know, what is?
It's a surveillance system basically, but it reads license plates and can sort of ascertain who's where, and of course it's indiscriminate, so we're all in it. It's a problem. Yes.
I have a question about, so what we're talking about in essence is that records aren't open. Right, so there's all these open record requests being made to data that's being hidden or not collected anymore, or there's all these exemptions. And as a journalist, I'm just wondering, if you could talk a little bit about like the confluence of like lack of openness and like the struggles in journalism. And I know this is like an assumed reality that we all are here because we're concerned about, but could you just talk a little bit about your experience over time as a journalist and what you've seen happening because of these changes in, you know, both government accountability and journalists to try to hold them account, and also the, you know, how it overlaps with the data situation that we're in now?
Well, you know, when I started as a reporter covering night police in Portland, Maine, 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., Wednesday through Sunday, I was not happy. However, the police station was 2 blocks from the newspaper. I walked over every night, saw the log, talked to the sergeant in charge. If there was something on the log that I wanted to see more of, they went and fished out the report. My night city editor listened to the police scanner. That's gone. So we had I mean, the cops didn't like us, you know. Again, we weren't in it to be liked, but they knew they had to cough up this information, and there was no fight. You know, and the Portland, Maine Press Herald was the big dog in town, and they dealt with us, you know, and I'm sure that's true in Seattle. The Times, you know, has a little more clout, maybe. So that's all gone. You know, the police scanners are gone. I mean, they exist, but they're not open, so you can't, you know, they're on different channels now, so you know, can't really keep track of that. And, you know, sometimes what we would hear on the police scanner was different from what was in the report, right? So, you know, you had this sort of cross-check that you could do. And then I went to DC, and I could actually walk through the halls of the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission. No problem, you know? And of course, okay, 9/11 came, that really closed off the federal government and many, and state government, I think, too. You know, you can't, everybody's got to go through a scanner. I mean, I can't argue with that, right? But that also made it harder to do, you know, your job as a journalist. And, you know, I think things just have closed down more and more. You know, people don't answer their phones. I mean, I know that's a little bit generational, but, you know, try calling a government agency, forget it. You cannot get a human being on the phone. So, you know, it's all gotten a lot harder, which is all the more reason you have to cultivate the people you can meet with and really meet with people as much as you can and, you know, talk to your neighbors about what's bugging them. And I cannot underscore face-to-face contact more than I am. I think that's the only way journalists are going to be able to keep doing their jobs. You know, and then there are people, I mean, you look at what's coming out of the FBI right now, which is in an incredibly scary state. There are people leaking out of there, clearly, you know, about Kash Patel and his stuff. So, I mean, you know, being a whistleblower right now is pretty dangerous, but there are people doing it. And you got to find those people and protect them. And that's where I think we are, both federally and, you know, state is a little less tense probably, but, you know, it depends. And of course, your legislature and your state Supreme Court just said the legislature does not have to be subject to public records, which actually I was interested that was even being debated here because most states' legislatures are exempt. I don't even know one where it's open. So, but you know, those people know a lot too. And if you can get them to talk to you, they're very, very knowledgeable.
Can I ask you about a term that you use in the book that I would love to hear your thoughts on? So you describe things as information blockades. Yeah. And I'd love to hear, so I found it really provocative, in part because usually when I think of a blockade as something that someone does to prevent someone else from being able to leave something. Mm-hmm. Like, so it's like one country blockades another country's harbor. Mm-hmm. And when I was first reading it, I was like, they're blockading themselves. Like, so I was just curious about, but it kind of makes sense in that actually what they're doing is they're blockading people from, but so I'm curious, like you're like, how would you describe the term? Like, I don't, just your thoughts on it.
Question. So, I guess I have this vision that they're erecting these walls and we, the public, are on the other side, and you just can't get through. And, I see the government just sort of putting up barriers all the time, whether it's, not unlike what you might see on a street where they're redirecting traffic or something, but way taller.
Yeah.
You can't leap over the fence. So it's sort of an image, I guess, that I have thought about, but it's definitely how I have felt. And I think a lot of the people I wrote about felt they're like, wait a minute, I can't walk into City Hall and get this information.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So when it comes to public records, sometimes, as you were mentioning, you were underscoring the importance of face-to-face communication, but sometimes stories start with documents and not live sources, and sometimes you don't know the whole story before you ask for public records. Maybe that's why you're inquiring about public records, right?
Right.
So, if you don't have all the information you need to understand the story, how do you know which public records to ask for?
Yeah.
And then amongst all the jargon and the text included in those documents, how do you piece together the story from the public records?
Yeah. Well, I do think you have to have a combination of human contact and paper. Sometimes, if you are starting with public records, I think, and this is some advice that they all give you, which is start narrow, if you think you know what you want, but also you can get some advice from the public records custodian. Is this something you have? How should I phrase this? They will help you. And then if you get the documents, you will often see names in there and other references to other things, and then you can start to expand your request. But do you have a particular example in mind that you're thinking about? Or?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, because public records can be hard to navigate, and of course, you only get what you ask for.
Right,
and
if
so,
that.
Right. And so, if you don't fully know the story of the story, how do you get enough background to actually find out what the story is?
Right.
How do you sift through that?
Yeah, often, in my case, a tip came in from somebody, or I had a conversation that made me think about something. So it often starts actually with a person, but it can also go the other way. And actually, sometimes, think about stuff like accident rates, or on campus. What's the crime rate on campus? How would you get that information? How about food inspection on campus? I always love that story. It's like, it's not good, usually. And students write about it. You should be able to get that. Somebody's inspecting the foods process here. It'd be interesting to know. Or maybe it wouldn't be interesting to know. But, you can sort of think about things in your own environment. Which, as I said, my whole kind of travel or journey down this path came about because I was having problems getting information, which led me to think about other people. Anyway.
Miranda, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
You guys were great.